It is day 87 since Nancy Guthrie went missing. I'm actually back in Arizona. I'm back outside Nancy Guthrie's house. That's her house right back there. It's a lot quieter now that it's been almost 3 months. Obviously, there's no real media out here right now, but I'm back in town, just looking into a couple of new angles. I'm working on a special coming up, just trying to really keep the story alive. Obviously, you can still see there's still a ton of flowers here outside Nancy's house. There's a memorial. You guys remember there was the memorial outside the house when everything was kind of going on, but there's still quite a bit of flowers out here, so it's just there's still a lot of yellow ribbons in the trees, which you can see up here behind me. So, for the people who live here, it's still really, really fresh, everything that happened, and I'm going to get into that in this episode.
87 days. That is not an approximation. It is not a round number selected for rhetorical weight. It is the precise number of days since Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, a retired educator, the mother of NBC News anchor Savannah Guthrie, and a woman known to the neighbors on her quiet Catalina Foothills Street simply as Nancy was last confirmed to be inside her home near Tucson, Arizona. In those 87 days, a substantial and documented body of forensic evidence has accumulated in the public record. Blood. Her blood, confirmed through laboratory analysis, was recovered at her residence. A doorbell camera at the property was deliberately tampered with before or during the incident. Surveillance footage captured a masked individual on her porch carrying a backpack subsequently identified as a purchase from a big box retail chain, who pulled weeds from the ground to cover a camera he apparently did not notice until he was already standing in front of it. Ransom notes have been received, demanding payment in Bitcoin, structured in a split payment arrangement that, forensic analysts have noted, creates not one but two distinct opportunities for digital tracing by investigators. A DNA hair sample recovered from the scene was transported to a private laboratory in Florida, where it remained for 11 weeks before being transferred to the FBI laboratory for advanced forensic analysis. And over $1 million in publicly announced reward money has not produced an arrest, has not produced a named suspect, has not produced the one piece of information that Nancy Guthrie's neighbor articulated to Brian Enton with more forensic precision than most analysts heard covering this case. A name to put to the masked figure captured on that surveillance footage outside her door. This update is filed from Arizona. Reporter Brian Enton has just concluded his visit with Aldine, one of Nancy Guthrie's immediate neighbors, and one of the most consistent, credible witness sources in this investigation. What she shared with Brian Enton today, layered against the full evidentiary framework this case has built over 87 days, produces the most complete forensic picture of this investigation that this channel has assembled in one place. This is True Crime Hex. We follow the evidence, we follow the timeline, we follow the investigative logic. And this is day 87. Before entering the forensic record, it is worth establishing what this location looks like today because the physical landscape of an active missing persons case is itself informative. During field reporting, Brian Enton drove past Nancy Guthrie's house before going to see Aldine. The street is quiet in the way that streets return to quiet after a prolonged disruption, not the ordinary quiet of a normal Tuesday, but the particular quiet of a place that has been loud and is now waiting. The satellite trucks are gone. The reporters conducting live shots from the sidewalk are gone. The media infrastructure that surrounded this case in its first weeks has dissolved, as it always does, back into the next breaking story. What has not dissolved is the memorial. There are still flowers outside Nancy Guthrie's home, a significant number of them, and yellow ribbons tied to the trees on her street, wrapped around the mailboxes of the neighbors who live on this block, remain in place. At 87 days, in the January heat that has given way to April heat, those ribbons are still there. People are still coming by. Not in the numbers of the early weeks, but they are coming. The flowers, Aldine told Brian Enton, are still being refreshed. Consider that not emotionally, but analytically. A maintained physical memorial at 87 days, in a case that has received national coverage, tells us something specific about the community's psychological posture. Collective grief that has been sustained this long, without resolution, without a body, without an arrest, without a named suspect, without a definitive narrative of what happened, is grief that has not been privately rationalized. The people who live on this street, who have known Nancy Guthrie for years and, in some cases for decades, do not have a working theory that gives them closure. They are maintaining that memorial because there is nowhere else to direct attention that has nowhere to land. That is not sentiment. That is a behavioral data point. And behavioral data points in the immediate geography of an active investigation matter. Now, into the forensic record of this case beginning not at day 87, but at day 1. Because to understand where this investigation stands right now, it is essential to understand what the evidence established from the beginning and what the decisions made in those first hours may have cost. The 11th of January 2026 is the date on which Aldine, from her bathroom window, at an angle that gave her a view of the street in front of Nancy Guthrie's home, observed a person walking. Not walking in the way that neighbors walk on a residential street on an ordinary morning, walking in a way that registered as unusual. She cannot characterize it with greater precision than that, as she shared with NBC News reporter Brian Enton during field reporting on this case. She did not see the person's face. She registered the behavior as anomalous. She has thought about it many times since. And the FBI, after learning of her observation through earlier coverage on this channel, returned to Aldine specifically to follow up on what she saw. The evidentiary significance of what Aldine observed on January 11th demands careful examination before the analysis proceeds, because it has been insufficiently addressed in the coverage this case has received. In missing persons investigations, a witness observation that occurs on the day of or immediately adjacent to a disappearance functions as what investigators call a behavioral anchor point. Even when that observation cannot produce a descriptive identification, even when the witness cannot name who they saw, cannot describe a face, cannot provide information specific enough to generate an investigative lead on its own, it contributes something essential. It confirms behavioral anomaly in a specific location at a specific time. That is not nothing. That is a data point. And data points aggregate. What Aldine's observation on January 11th tells us, placed alongside what is known to have happened at Nancy Guthrie's residence that same day, is this. There was purposeful movement in and around this property. There was a person, or persons, whose presence in this neighborhood was sufficiently outside the ordinary pattern of activity that a long-term resident registered it as wrong. And the FBI considered that registration significant enough to revisit in a follow-up interview after learning it had been documented through this channel's earlier coverage. Federal investigators working a case at this level of resource expenditure do not return to a witness they consider low value. They return to Aldine because her account had something to contribute to the investigative picture they were building. Now, to what the forensic evidence from the residence itself established. Blood was found at Nancy Guthrie's home. This has been publicly confirmed. It has been confirmed as her blood. That confirmation carries specific forensic implications that deserve methodical examination, because the way that detail has been treated in broad media coverage has not reflected the investigative weight it carries. Blood at a scene does not simply confirm violence occurred. It is a biological record of contact. It establishes sequence blood in a particular location at a particular concentration tells investigators something about what happened there, in what order, and with what force. The fact that this was confirmed as Nancy Guthrie's blood, and not the blood of another individual present at the scene, also tells investigators something about the nature of that contact. And blood evidence is durable. It survives. It is recoverable for DNA analysis, and it can be cross-referenced against DNA evidence collected from other sources, including, crucially, from individuals investigators develop as persons of interest as the investigation progresses. The doorbell camera at the property was tampered with. This is a forensic fact that warrants careful consideration because it changes the interpretive framework of this case in a specific direction. Tampering with a surveillance device at a residential property before or during a criminal act is not a reflexive behavior. It is a planned behavior. It requires prior knowledge that the device exists. It requires either prior observation of the property physical surveillance conducted before the incident or information about the property's security infrastructure obtained through another means. Someone with no knowledge of that camera would not have tampered with it because they would not have known it was there to tamper with. This is the detail that most directly contradicts a random or opportunistic interpretation of what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Random, opportunistic actors do not disable doorbell cameras they knew about in advance because they did not know about them. The tampered camera tells us this was planned. That planning required information about this specific residence, and that information was either gathered through prior observation, through personal knowledge of the property, or through communication with someone who possessed that knowledge. Each of those information acquisition pathways narrows the possible universe of responsible individuals in a specific and investigatively meaningful way. Prior observation implies time spent in this neighborhood, in proximity to this house, without detection. Personal knowledge implies familiarity with the property's layout. Communication implies a connection between the individual on that footage and someone closer to this address than the surveillance footage alone would suggest. The tampered camera is not just evidence of planning. It is evidence of access to specific information, and that specificity has an origin. And then there is the masked figure on the surveillance footage. This is the evidence detail that Aldine articulated in the clearest forensic terms heard from any non-investigative source in this case, stated directly to news reporter Brian Enton during his most recent visit. She said, "Someone knows that man in the video by the door. Someone just has to say who it is." She is correct. And the reason she is correct deserves precise explanation, because the continued public non-identification of this individual is one of the most significant unresolved questions in this investigation. Surveillance footage captured a person at Nancy Guthrie's residence. This individual was wearing a mask. This individual was carrying a backpack that has since been identified, through investigative work, as a purchase from a big-box retail chain. This individual, according to publicly available reporting, pulled weeds from the ground near the camera not because weed removal was part of the plan, but because he had apparently not known the camera was there when he approached and needed to cover it once he realized it could document his presence. He pulled weeds from the ground because that was what was available to him in that moment. He improvised. That improvisation tells us something critical about who this person is. This was not a trained operative. This was not a professional criminal executing a rehearsed operation. The behavior captured in that footage, improvising a camera obstruction with vegetation because no planned alternative was available, is the behavior of someone who planned part of this, but not all of it. Someone who covered the doorbell camera, suggesting they knew it existed, but who apparently did not know about or adequately account for a second camera. Someone whose operational preparation had gaps. A mask conceals a face. It does not conceal height. It does not conceal build. It does not conceal gait, the specific, individualized pattern of movement that forensic kinesiologists have documented as one of the most consistent biometric identifiers available from surveillance footage. A person's walk is as distinctive as their handwriting. The masked individual on that footage moved in a specific way, in a specific body, carrying a specific weight and carriage. These are observable characteristics. They are characteristics that people who know this individual, who have watched this person walk across a parking lot, across a kitchen, across a workplace, would recognize. A backpack from a big box retail chain, weeds pulled from the ground, a gait that belongs to a specific human being. This is not the forensic signature of a sophisticated actor. This is the signature of a person who lives somewhere, who is known to people, and who can be identified. And yet this person, non-sophisticated, operating with improvised tools in a residential neighborhood, in a case that has generated national media coverage and over $1 million in reward money, has not been publicly identified at day 87. The only forensically consistent explanations for that non-identification are limited. Either the FBI has already identified this individual and is strategically withholding that identification because the disclosure would compromise an ongoing investigative operation, which is standard procedure and entirely plausible. Or this person exists in a social and geographic context so isolated from the normal channels through which such identifications occur that no one who recognizes them has yet chosen to come forward. Both explanations carry distinct investigative implications, and Aldine's assessment that someone simply needs to make the decision to speak is precisely correct regardless of which explanation is accurate. If the FBI has already made the identification, that information will become public when they are ready to act on it. If they have not, the identification is waiting for a single human decision, the decision of the person who recognizes that figure to pick up the phone. There is a dimension of this investigation's public record that has not received the forensic scrutiny it deserves, and it directly relates to the investigative posture of the agency most publicly associated with this case at the local level. Reporting on this case has confirmed that the sergeant who supervised the initial law enforcement response to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had been in that supervisory role for approximately 6 months at the time of the incident, and had not previously worked a case of this nature and complexity. Separately, reporting has indicated that experienced detectives within that department had been reassigned not as the result of performance evaluations, but, according to sources cited in that reporting, as a consequence of internal departmental dynamics related to loyalty to the department's leadership. The department's search and rescue aircraft was reportedly grounded at the relevant period because the aircraft's pilot had been moved to street patrol assignments. These facts are presented here as what they are: reported facts, sourced from journalism covering this case. These are not characterizations of misconduct. They are not assignments of blame. What they are is forensic context, and the context matters for this specific reason. The first hours of a missing persons investigation are, investigatively speaking, irreplaceable. The decisions made in those hours about which evidence to collect, how to secure the scene, which witness accounts to document first, how to establish and preserve the evidentiary perimeter cannot be reconstructed after the fact. There is no second day one. The institutional and personnel conditions under which those first-hour decisions were made in the Nancy Guthrie case are part of the public record. and that record warrants careful, evidence-based, analytical attention. The FBI assumption of a primary investigative role in this case is consistent with what we would expect when federal resources and federal jurisdiction are deemed appropriate when the nature of the case, its complexity, its public profile, and the possible federal criminal dimensions warrant that escalation. But the FBI did not investigate the first hours of this case. The question of what those first hours produced, and what they may have foreclosed, is a question this channel intends to examine in significant depth in an upcoming special report. Now, before going further, this channel needs to address viewers directly for a moment. If this video is part of ongoing engagement with the Nancy Guthrie case, if this coverage has been sought because it offers evidence-based analysis rather than speculation dressed up as insight, then this channel was built for exactly that purpose. And if this analysis has been of value, there is one action that keeps this story alive. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The special report True Crime Hex is producing on the Nancy Guthrie case will represent the most comprehensive forensic reconstruction of this investigation published in the public domain. It will go deeper into the evidentiary framework, the investigative timeline, and the analytical questions raised by the evidence than any prior coverage on this channel. That report is coming. When it arrives, every subscriber needs to be here for it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and if this case has been followed and there is someone else who should be following it, share this video. That is how this story stays alive. That is how public pressure is sustained on an investigation that must not be allowed to fade. Subscribe, turn on notifications, share. Let us now examine the DNA evidence in full, because it represents one of the most forensically significant and procedurally complex dimensions of this investigation, and it has not been adequately explained to the public in terms that allow for meaningful evaluation. A DNA hair sample was collected from the scene at Nancy Guthrie's residence. This hair sample was sent to a private laboratory, a forensic laboratory in Florida. It remained in that laboratory for 11 weeks. At the 11-week mark, it was transferred to the FBI laboratory for advanced forensic analysis. The FBI, when asked about this transfer, clarified publicly that this was not new evidence, that they had requested the sample over 2 months prior to the transfer. The forensic implications of that timeline require careful examination because they matter in ways that have not been clearly communicated in public coverage of this case. 11 weeks is a long time for a hair sample in a missing persons case of this urgency and resource investment to remain in a private laboratory. The distinction between private forensic laboratory capabilities and federal capabilities is not a minor administrative distinction. It is a substantive, analytical one. Private forensic laboratories operate under different protocols, different equipment constraints, and different case prioritization frameworks than federal facilities. The FBI laboratory maintains forensic capabilities, including advanced STR analysis, mitochondrial DNA analysis, touch DNA processing, and genetic genealogy capabilities applied through programs with access to GEDmatch and family tree DNA databases that are simply not available at the same level in most private facilities. There is also a forensic distinction between types of hair evidence that is relevant to understanding why this sample required advanced federal analysis. A hair recovered with an intact root follicle contains nuclear DNA, the gold standard for individual identification. A shed hair, recovered without the root, contains only mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineage rather than producing an individual identification. The specific analytical challenge presented by the hair recovered at this scene has not been publicly confirmed, but the decision to transfer the sample to the FBI after 11 weeks at a private facility is consistent with a sample that required capabilities beyond what that private facility could fully deliver. The FBI has the sample now. The results of that analysis have not been publicly disclosed, which is entirely consistent with standard practice when those results are driving active investigative leads. You do not announce what your evidence shows when announcing it would compromise what you are doing with it. Let us now address the Bitcoin ransom communication, because this is the element of the public evidence record that has been most incompletely analyzed in terms of its forensic implications. Ransom notes have been received in the Nancy Guthrie case. These communications demand payment in cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, and they are structured, according to publicly available reporting, in a split payment arrangement. The specific structure of that payment demand is forensically significant in ways that deserve clear explanation. When a ransom demand is structured to require payment in multiple tranches in split installments, rather than a single transfer, it creates, from an investigative standpoint, a pattern rather than a single transaction event. Bitcoin transactions are recorded on a public blockchain. The blockchain is a permanent, transparent ledger of every transaction that has ever occurred within the network. While individual wallet addresses are pseudonymous rather than directly linked to personal identity at the point of transaction, the movement of funds through the blockchain creates a traceable pattern. Funds do not simply disappear once received into a wallet. They are moved. They are converted. They are transferred through exchanges or over-the-counter desks that, in the majority of jurisdictions, are subject to Know Your Customer regulations requiring identity documentation. Every movement is a data point. Every exchange interaction is a potential identity disclosure. The FBI has demonstrated the practical application of this capability in prior operations. In the Colonial Pipeline ransomware case, federal investigators recovered the majority of the ransom payment, approximately 63 Bitcoin, then valued at approximately $2.3 million, through blockchain tracing methodology applied after the payment was made. That was not theoretical. That was executed. The capability exists. It has been used. And a split payment structure creates not one but two transaction events, two separate on-chain data points, two tracing opportunities, two moments at which a wallet address touches an exchange or conversion mechanism. Retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has publicly called for investigators to pay the ransom and trace the wallet. That is an experienced federal investigator's public assessment of the investigative value of that action. It is on the record, and it is consistent with the documented forensic capability the FBI has demonstrated in prior cryptocurrency tracing operations. What the evidentiary record establishes is this: the structure of those ransom communications is not the structure of a sophisticated criminal operation. A professional who has studied federal cryptocurrency tracing methodology does not structure a payment demand in a way that creates multiple blockchain transaction opportunities. A split payment demand is the structure chosen by someone who is thinking about how to receive payment, not about how to avoid forensic tracing. That behavioral profile is consistent with everything else the evidence in this case tells us about the individual or individuals responsible, planned in some dimensions, improvised in others, and not operating with the methodological precision of someone who has done this before. Let us return now to Aldine, because there is a dimension of Brian Enton's conversation with her today that has not yet been fully addressed, and it carries analytical content that deserves its own space in this discussion. The letters. In the course of this investigation, unsolicited written communications were sent to individuals associated with coverage of this case. These letters arrived not just at standard media contact points, but at residential addresses, including Aldine's home. This warrants a pause. Someone invested enough effort in this case to locate and use residential mailing addresses for individuals connected to the investigation's public coverage. That is not a passive behavior. That is an active decision to seek out and write to private individuals at their private addresses. The motivations behind that decision can range widely, but the effort itself is notable. Aldine's assessment of these communications was measured. She described the authors as people with, in her words, weird ideas. She expressed confidence that the letters did not represent significant investigative leads. She also noted, and Brian Enton has documented this account as precisely as the on-the-ground reporting allows, that the FBI agent she has come to know through this process has been engaged with these communications, and is, in her words, working really hard. The forensic framework for understanding unsolicited communications in a high-profile case is this: every active investigation of this profile generates a volume of tip communications that ranges from credible, specific, and actionable to what the Bureau internally categorizes as no-lead correspondence, communications from individuals who are emotionally engaged with a case but who possess no actual knowledge of what occurred. The challenge is not in identifying that these two categories exist. The challenge is in triage. Every communication, regardless of its surface plausibility, must be evaluated against the existing evidentiary framework before it can be categorized and set aside. That takes investigative time. That takes resources, and in a case where investigative time and resources are finite, the volume and character of unsolicited communications is itself a data point about public engagement with the case. This channel does not suggest that Aldine's assessment of the letters is wrong. The public record does not provide access to the evidentiary context that would allow for a definitive determination. What the public record does confirm is that the FBI is equipped for this triage process, and their continued active presence in this neighborhood at day 87 indicates that the volume of no-lead correspondence has not overwhelmed the investigative operation. They are still here. They are still interviewing. They are still engaged. Now, let us address the United Cajun Navy, because their involvement, and specifically what happened when they attempted to contribute to the search operation in this case, is a documented fact in the public record that has not received adequate analytical attention. The United Cajun Navy is a volunteer search and rescue organization with significant operational experience in large-scale missing person searches. They have deployed in high-profile cases. They have experience coordinating with law enforcement in complex search environments. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, their attempt to assist the search operation was met with resistance from the sheriff's office. This fact warrants careful engagement. because there is both a legitimate institutional explanation for it and a legitimate analytical question raised by it. The legitimate institutional explanation first. Law enforcement agencies have well-documented operational reasons to manage the involvement of external parties in active investigations. Those reasons include the risk of evidence contamination in areas designated as forensic scenes, the complexity of coordinating search grids when multiple independent parties are operating in the same geographic area, questions of jurisdictional authority and liability, and the genuine concern that volunteer activity, however well-intentioned, can produce public-facing developments that compromise the confidentiality of active investigative work. These are not fabricated rationales. They are real operational considerations that investigators weigh when determining how to engage with external search organizations. And yet, at 87 days, with no recovery, with no publicly named suspect, with a woman who is 84 years old and whose physical needs medical, environmental, survivability would be acutely time-sensitive if she is somewhere that a ground search could reach. The decision to limit supplemental search capacity warrants analytical scrutiny, not accusatory scrutiny, not politicized scrutiny, forensic scrutiny, grounded in the specific question of whether the operational justifications for limiting the United Cajun Navy's involvement justifications that may have been sound and appropriate at day 14 or day 21 remained, the optimal investigative decision-making framework at the scale of absence we are now examining. This channel will go deeper into this in the special report. There is more to be said about the institutional response to this case, and it will be said with the same evidentiary discipline applied to every other dimension of this analysis. What follows is a precise accounting of where this investigation stands at day 87, as best as the publicly documented evidentiary record allows. Before the closing analysis of this update, it is important to separate cleanly what is known from what is not, so that every inference drawn here has its evidentiary footing made visible. What we know. Nancy Guthrie was last confirmed at her Catalina Foothills residence on the 11th of January 2026. Blood confirmed as hers was recovered at the scene. A doorbell camera at the property was tampered with, indicating prior knowledge of its existence. Surveillance footage captured a masked individual on her porch carrying a backpack sourced from a retail chain, who improvised a ground cover for a camera he apparently had not accounted for in advance. Ransom communications have been received, structured as split Bitcoin payments across multiple tranches. A DNA hair sample from the scene spent 11 weeks at a private laboratory before FBI transfer, with the FBI having requested the sample over 2 months prior. The department that initially supervised the response was operating under documented personnel and resource conditions that have been publicly reported by multiple outlets. The FBI is leading the investigation and maintains an active, ongoing presence in this neighborhood, including multiple rounds of witness interviews that have included return visits to previously interviewed sources. The United Cajun Navy's offer of search assistance was declined by local law enforcement. The reward fund exceeds $1 million. There are yellow ribbons on the trees of this street. And there is a neighbor named Aldine who thinks about Nancy Guthrie every single day and who told Brian Enton today, with more forensic clarity than most public commentary on this case has achieved, that someone knows who is in that video. Someone just has to say who it is. What we do not know. The identity of the masked individual captured on surveillance footage. The full scope of what the FBI laboratory's advanced DNA analysis has produced. The complete content and investigative disposition of the Ransom communications. The location of Nancy Guthrie. That gap between what the evidence has established and what it has not yet resolved is the investigative space in which this case currently lives, and it is not a static space. It is being actively worked. Here is what the FBI's behavioral pattern in this neighborhood tells us about the status of that work. Federal investigators do not maintain a vehicle presence in a residential neighborhood for 87 days in a case they have internally classified as dormant. The administrative category of a dormant or cold case comes with specific resource allocation protocols that look nothing like what is being observed in this neighborhood. The FBI's continued presence here, vehicular surveillance, return visits to witnesses, ongoing engagement with the community is the behavioral signature of an active investigation that has not exhausted its leads. There is something driving this forward. The public does not yet know what it is. It is important to be precise about what that inference is and is not. It is not a claim that an arrest is imminent. It is not a claim that investigators have definitively identified a suspect. What it is a reading of investigative behavior, a reading based on what sustained FBI presence at this scale and duration means in practice. Federal agents are not kept active in a residential neighborhood for nearly 3 months on an investigation the Bureau has internally abandoned. The activity is informative. The question is what, exactly, it is informating. The evidentiary picture in this case, the tampered camera indicating advanced knowledge of this specific property, the non-professional forensic signature of the masked individual, the blockchain traceable Bitcoin demand structure, the DNA material now in federal laboratory hands, and the surveillance documentation of a person who is physically identifiable by people who know them, points toward a resolution that is not dependent on luck. It is dependent on two things: continued investigative commitment and a single human decision by someone who recognizes that figure in the video and has not yet chosen to act on that recognition. Aldine said it. Someone knows. Someone just has to say. And if you are watching this, and you know something, if you have seen that figure in the surveillance footage and recognize them, if you saw something on January 11th in this neighborhood that you have not yet reported, if you have information about the circumstances of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance that has not yet reached law enforcement, the number to contact is the FBI tip line. That action, that single phone call, may be the variable that resolves 87 days of absence, over $1 million in reward money, and the sustained grief of an entire street full of people who are still waiting for an answer. For Nancy Guthrie, for this neighborhood, for the forensic record that this case deserves. This is True Crime Hex. I will see you in the special report.